Winston Churchill was once voted the greatest Briton ever in a BBC television poll, and it's perhaps not that surprising. After all, he did lead the country to victory in World War II against Nazi Germany. Surely that earns him the status of hero. Well, many feel the wartime leader had a dark side. Some have even referred to him as a white supremacist and mass murderer. Why? Well, in 1943, India suffered a famine in Bengal province when it was under British colonial rule. Churchill refused to send food, and up to 3 million people starved to death. He's even reported to have said, "Relief will do nothing, for Indians breed like rabbits." So, is it time history looks back differently on Winston Churchill? Well, joining me now from Rabat is Ruqaya Izzidien. She's a journalist and author of The Watermelon Boys, the story of British intervention in Iraq during World War I. And Warren Dockter is an author and lecturer in international politics at Aberystwyth University. Ruqaya, let me start with you. And of course, the Bengal famine wasn't just the only example of why people consider Churchill a villain. What do you think? Hero or villain? Or something in between?
For me, yeah, something in between. For me, it's not about reducing Churchill to a hero or villain status. It's about looking at his actions as a whole. Because it's okay to talk about his heroics, but what we're seeing today is that comes at the expense of his crimes. So for me, it's about creating a space where we're free to talk more in a more nuanced way about an historical figure.
Right.
So yeah, as you mentioned, there's the Bengal famine, which sometimes it's reported as 4 million Indians died in 1943, prevented Australian wheat ships from offloading their stock in India while people were dying on shore. He prevented his own cabinet members who recorded in their personal diaries that they were trying to find a solution to the Bengal famine, and Churchill personally prevented them from doing that. And as you said, he referred to them as responsible for the famine because they were breeding like rabbits, and he also called Indians a beastly people with a beastly religion and said that he hated Indians. So when you mention white supremacy, I don't know if there's a more clear example for it than that.
Right, right. It's interesting. Warren Dockter, as a teenager growing up in South Africa, learning history, I learned World War II history, and Churchill was nothing other than a hero. Great speeches, of course. We shall fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields. We shall never surrender, right? This man was nothing other than a hero. As a South African, I was not taught that Churchill, as a journalist, defended the concentration camps for Afrikaners in the Anglo-Boer War, right? So was that a problem? Was I not given a proper education about the man?
Well, I think education in Britain, it's moving on. I mean, I completely agree that we do need to think about Winston Churchill in a much more nuanced way. And I think it doesn't do a lot of good to think of it as completely didactic, that he's either a hero or a villain. Of course, he's infinitely complex, and he was in British politics for 60 years. But even the example of the Bengal famine, I think, is more complex than certain narratives would say, because there are loads of correspondence where he's pleading with the President Roosevelt in the United States to send grain, to send help to India as well. So, I mean, I don't think it was anything comparable, for instance, to what Stalin did in the Ukraine. And often that's how it can be presented sometimes. I think there's negligence. And of course, Winston Churchill, being a man of his times, I think was racist in the same sense that most white British people of the aristocracy in the Edwardian era were.
Right.
But you know, married to that is the same fact that Winston Churchill used his speeches and used his rhetoric to set this notion of freedom forward, so that even people like Nelson Mandela would reference him as a hero themselves later on.
Ruqaya?
So, you know, it's absolutely correct to say that he is incredibly complex with an often enigmatic legacy.
Right, Ruqaya, man of his time. We hear this a lot, and that's an important point. Look at the context. He was a man of his time. What do you think?
I want to go back to my area of specialty for a second to answer that question. After the First World War, Churchill oversaw the suppression of the Iraqi independence, first as Minister for War and Air and later as Secretary of State for Colonies. And during that time, Britain adopted a standard practice of aerial bombardment as a replacement for policing their subjects in order to force villagers into submission. They actually obliterated one entire village in 1923, killing 144 people. And do you know the reason? It was for non-payment of taxes to the British, their occupiers, and it wasn't even an act of rebellion.
So do you believe he was a war criminal, Ruqaya?
I mean, I'm not really interested in titles that don't really give us any room for discussion. I think it's nuanced.
Right.
And I think our entertainment industry and society at large is filled with these heroic depictions of Churchill that don't leave space, and even society doesn't accept an alternative narrative of this. So when you have commentators appear on television to try and discuss in the UK to try and discuss Churchill's crimes,
right,
they are shut down, they are spoken over, and they're told that they're unpatriotic. So any narrative that challenges...
Let me take that, and because we don't have a lot of time, and my apologies for interrupting. Let me take that and pose it to Warren. Warren, is he too entangled in British identity and the post-World War II British identity that was created for people like Ruqaya to have a proper conversation with other people who love him, because they just have this reflex of feeling offended that how dare you challenge our idol? Is that a fair point?
Well, I do think it's a fair point, and I think it's something that we have to think about. And what hopefully more discussion and more exploration of history will do is make it so that we can have these conversations. I'm very familiar with this instance in which the villagers were gunned down, and I write about this in my book on Churchill and the Islamic War. And in fact, Churchill wrote reprimands in 1921 to anyone who abused their powers or was caught doing this, and called for their court-martial, and even threatened to shut down the entire Air Corps, which was in its infancy. And he threatened General Trenchard with taking away the entire thing. So this is, again, one of those complex things. For instance, he heavily condemned the Amritsar massacre, and at the same time, tried to sort of was very pro sort of British Empire in India in the 30s, which was contextually very unpopular as well. So I think there's a case of Churchill that he's sort of very Edwardian and taken into kind of modern times. But beyond that, I do think it's important that we have these discussions that are nuanced, and it's okay that we may arrive at different conclusions. But the point is that we keep talking and exploring the history here.
Ruqaya?
You talk about him condemning individuals abusing their power. Would you not consider condoning the use of poison gas against Iraqis and abuse of power? Would you not consider bombing people instead of having actual governance and abuse of power? Actually, of bombing of Iraqis, Churchill, not famously enough, said that he's strongly in favor of using poison gas against uncivilized tribes because it would spread a lively terror. This, to me, is an abuse of power. And just because he may have said some things in the past or some things in his time and may have done heroic actions, it doesn't wipe away his crimes, and it doesn't justify his crimes.
Warren?
I mean, I agree, and I'm certainly not trying to justify his crimes. But again, I think it's about the greater exploration. So, for instance, when he's spoken about using poison gas, he's referring specifically to lacrimatory gas. And there's a great article by a guy named R.M. Douglas who sort of talks about the use of gas. And Churchill's failure. And Churchill intended to use actual poison gas, but didn't in the end. But he initially wanted to use for the suppression of...
Just bombs and just, it's okay then to use tear gas and bombs so long as it's not poison gas.
I'm not saying that it's okay to use colonial air policing ever. I mean, it's a horrific thing. But this is all about the notion of modernism and technology, and Churchill trying to do imperialism on the cheap, which is what he'd been asked to do. I mean, and again, this is what I mean about it being sort of heavily complex. And I think ultimately that Churchill's relationship with the Middle East is a much more sympathetic picture than most people think. I mean, that's certainly the conclusion I reached in my book.
Yeah, very finally, Ruqaya, I mean, was Churchill, would you give him credit for helping defeat Hitler? I mean, people, tend to say, a lot of British people and Americans will say, well, you'd be speaking German if it wasn't for us, right? I mean, was he lucky in the sense that he was right about Hitler and people like Neville Chamberlain were so catastrophically wrong about Hitler, so the timing was good for him? Or do you credit him with defeating Hitler?
Honestly, I'm hesitant to answer that because it just comes back to the narrative of let's praise Hitler, and should we praise Hitler, and demanding of people to praise Hitler in order to justify their opinions. Like, of course, Hitler helped to end the war, but so did the servicemen,
Churchill,
so did
yeah.
Roosevelt.
You mean Churchill?
Sorry,
Yeah,
of course, Churchill. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Could I answer? You asked me a question that I didn't actually get to answer.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You asked me whether we're imposing modern perceptions on Churchill, and the point I wanted to get to was that, did we ever bomb an English village for not paying their taxes? Did we ever replace Bobbies on the Beat with aerial bombardment? No, we didn't. So I don't think it's about imposing modern standards. But in order to look at history, you have to do so with a modern eye, because that's the nature of history. And history does show us that Churchill had white supremacist, eugenicist beliefs, and that he held one race as more human than all the others.
Okay, well, I think as a start, this was really good, having this conversation. I hope to have you both back on the program in the not too distant future again. Ruqaya Izzidien and Warren Dockter, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.